when you start understanding the makeup of these parents that are very diverse, from parents who are in their late 60s to parents who are in their 30s raising Gen Z, it kind of gives you some insight as to why we see the familial breakdown that is taking place in our generation today.
We spend a fair amount of time talking about, for example, some of the different generations. Generation Y, which is oftentimes referred to as the millennial generation, and Generation Z, sometimes called the iGen generation, and we do a millennial roundtable. We've also cited quite a bit of psychological research that suggests that the youngest generation, so-called Generation Z, are really dealing with some very significant issues. And that's why I'm excited about this new book entitled Parenting Gen Z, Guiding Your Child Through a Hostile Culture. It is written by Jason Jimenez, who has been with us before. He is the founder and president of Stand Strong Ministries. He is, of course, as you may know, a Christian worldview speaker. He's been a faculty member at Summit Ministries, co-authored a number of books that we've talked about in the past. More recently, we've talked about his book, Hijacking Jesus, How Progressive Christians Are Remaking Him and Taking Over the Church. We've talked about his book, Challenging Conversations, a practical guide to discuss controversial topics in the church. And, of course, Jason Jimenez is the author of this book, Parenting Gen Z. So, Jason, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
I guess we can break it down to a few things. First of all, who is Gen Z? And then you talk about parents raising Gen Z and their flaws. But before we get into that, in your introduction, you talk about the fact that you and others find yourself saying, this is really a challenge. If your children are born between 1997 and 2012, you're in the category of that. And when we look at the impact that the culture has made on these children, the impact of the digital devices and the rest, we're dealing with a very significant need. And that's, of course, why you wrote the book in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, as a parent of 4 Gen Zers and working with millennials before this and tracking with them and with the participation of Focus on the Family, Kerby, what we have found is that Gen Z they're an amazing generation. There's no question. They're very creative. A lot of them like to have open jokes. They're very engaging, hospitality, giving their shirt off their back type thing, a lot similar to millennials. But tragically, what we've seen over a course of time, especially when we saw COVID, hit our nation and around the world, this generation is very stressed, and there's a lot of pressures and a lot of insecurities that they are dealing with. And sadly, even when you look at the millennial generation previously that they've obviously been heavily influenced by, you definitely see a lack of Christian faith or belief in God among Gen Zers, and most of them now have entered the college years. And so when you're evaluating this generation and you're assessing them spiritually, religiously, culturally, you're definitely seeing a progressive nature that is taking place within them in their process of politics, religion, and even the familial status, meaning they're not holding to a traditional point of view.
One of the things that is so valuable about your book, it's worth the price of the book alone, is the 8 core traits. We don't necessarily need to talk about all of them, but a divergent identity, significant creativity, sort of alluded to that. This one, religious uncertainty. Number 4, sexual fluidity, ethnic diversity, progressive mentality, language sensitivity, and emotional instability. That was just a great summary of some of the things I've seen some of the psychologists and others that have been writing about this generation, and you go into each one of those 8 traits in more detail.
Yeah, I did this because, to your point, there's a lot of confusion, like any generation, or people get them confused, like, well, I thought those were millennials. And you're like, well, no, that's kind of the Gen Z, but they are similar to millennials, right? You get this back and forth sometimes, especially if you're dealing with people who are in sociology like you deal with and I deal with. But I wanted to do something to help people, work through the confusion, almost understand the beauty and also the complexity that comes with this creative generation. And so when I came up with these 8 traits, it was a way for me to even be more effective in how I communicate with them. Because oftentimes, as you know, Kerby, people right off the bat, and this is something I was talking with the team at Focus on the Family, we didn't want to, hash out things that have already been speculated or put out there. We wanted to be original, but also in a positive light, something that people can grab a hold of and say, oh, this really makes sense. This helps me better understand my child, or it helps me better understand my child's, friends. So I know how to engage them. Now, again, those 8 characteristics, they're very common among Gen Z, but that doesn't necessarily say that it speaks directly in the totality sense of your child. But it is a helpful way to kind of break down the complexity. So I'm grateful that it's helped you and others, because certainly when you start working through these things, whether it's a diversity or ethnicity or even a language sensitivity that is perpetrated within this generation, you get a sense, though, characteristically of why they do what they do and how they think. And when we have a better understanding without, again, assuming or having presuppositional ideas about them, but when we understand their makeup, if you will, it does help us to be more sympathetic. And as such, that we can have more dialogue. And again, the approach in this context with parents is the more you understand your child, the better you're able to help them. And that was the goal of the book.
Well said. Again, I might just mention that this book is endorsed by Natasha Crane and Brent Kunkel and Jonathan Morrow and David and Jason Benham and Sarah Stonestreet and many people we've interviewed, including somebody who's almost always in studio, Kathy Cook. And you have a section there where she reminds us as something that a book I probably promoted more than any other, Screens and Teens, which she talks about some of the lies that Gen Z believes. Lie number 1, I'm the center of my own universe. Number 2, I deserve to be happy all the time. Number 3, I must have choices. Number 4, I am my own authority. And number 5, information is all I need, so I don't need teachers. And one of the things I thought, Jason, was so helpful is that different generations of parents have actually parented their kids in different ways. And I never really kind of thought about that. I sort of intuitively knew it, but you did a very good job of helping us understand that there are different ways in which parents and parenting styles have varied over time. And then we'll get into some of the problems or some of the parenting flaws. But help us out. That's something that I thought was also great insight in your book.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Kerby, because working with these families for, almost 25 years now, and a lot of our friends, raising Gen Z like my wife and me, we have 2 in college, 1 in high school, 1 in middle school. And I was, through the years, you just notice, obviously, there's age gaps between you, or you see blended families, or the dad's a lot older than his wife, and because they're remarried, and maybe she was never married before, and he is on a 2nd or 3rd marriage. The reality is these are very common, and this isn't just outside of the church. And when I remember going back, writing the book Abandoned Faith, and trying to help bring hope and healing to parents of millennials, there was definitely waves of regret. And one of the things I found within the church, working in student ministry and family ministry, was there was not a lot of talk about the parents who were actually raising millennials. The focus was predominantly on the child. And again, that kind of feeds the nature of this self-individualistic, appointed regime of thinking. And when I was looking at Gen Z, I thought, this is actually very, very interesting, because they are being raised by a very diverse population of parents, whether it be from single parents or more multi-ethnic, familial status. And so what I did was I looked at 4 common groups, and I start with the older Gen X, or even the younger baby boomers. And what you find is that in that generation of parents, they're more realists. They're very responsible. And the biblical worldview is a lot stronger than if you were to look at the younger Gen X parents, which are idealists, and they have about a 30 to 25% biblical worldview, but they're very dependable. There's not as much divorce as you would find on the older millennial parents, and those are more consumerists, right? Again, feeding into the nature of our social media, shopping online. They're very relatable. This is when they want to become friends with their kids. There's a lot of discontentment among this generation of parents, and less than 20% of them have a biblical worldview. Well, then the 4th category is the younger millennial parents.
Yes.
These are narcissists. They're narcissists. They parent out of fear because of a lot of the school shootings and a lot of the things that they've grown up with. with all the information that is at the disposal of the palm of their hand on their phone. They're very agreeable. And the biblical worldview is non-existent, really, when it comes to this generation. And so when you start understanding the makeup of these parents that are very diverse, from parents who are in their late 60s to parents who are in their 30s raising Gen Z, it kind of gives you some insight as to why we see the familial breakdown that is taking place in our generation today.
That is so good. And again, that is on page 37. I would encourage people just look at that alone because you can kind of see your parenting style. But let's now, and again, I don't want to be overly critical of parents, but you do break it down into control parenting, paranoid parenting, and detached parenting. You've sort of alluded to that, but help us through, because that is, again, kind of the range of some of the kinds of problems of the parenting that is taking place right now that needs to be recovered and maybe reformed.
Yeah, again, we say this, as you know, Kerby, very well, not to discourage parents, but oftentimes it's very helpful in order for us to make progress or to figure out why something's happening in the home or why you don't get along with your son or your daughter. You have to understand that there's certain flaws that are there. As humans, we make mistakes. Even as Christian parents, right? When we try to give our kids to the Lord, sometimes we can interfere without allowing God to intervene. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes as Christians, we have faith in Christ, but we become faithless when it comes to responsibility of what we expect from our family. And so in that vein, and again, I'm not removed from this. As I said, I've been parenting now for over 20 years, our 4 kids. And there's a lot of mistakes, and I talk about it in the book. But in order to help parents work through where we need to improve, you have to start with looking at some of the flaws, some of the mistakes that we make. So, for example, and again, I put them in 3 categories because sometimes in our culture we have this polarity where we have these extremities, and it's like either you're, like I talk about, a free-range parent, you just let your kids do whatever, you think that's the proper way of parenting, and then you have the controlled parent who never lets their kids outside. Well, the reality is that doesn't really help us move things forward. What actually helps us is realizing that every single one of us are going to struggle in fear and to let go and to trust God. Some of us are going to do a better job when it comes to a certain child. Some other kids are more strong-willed than the other. That is reality. But one thing we have to do is, in order to kind of assess where we're at individually in our family, again, it's a single family, if it's a blended family, if you have mom and dad together who've been raising their kids, or they even have foster kids. I was just talking to a family after church yesterday who have a foster daughter who now they're going in the process of adopting. But the dynamics that brings into the equation has been very difficult for them. They were seeking for some advice. But when you look at parents who control, usually what you find is that there is a failure to prepare their child. Mm-hmm. And inevitably what that does is it creates conflict between the child and the parent. Well, then you also have an area that is very prominent among parents of Gen Z, and that is the paranoid parenting. Again, in our culture, as we've alluded to, you talked a lot on your show alone, of all the issues that this culture is faced with, with the downcline economic things, with the war between Russia, Ukraine, Hamas and Israel, school shootings on the rise, depression, suicide among young kids, even in the ages of elementary. This can cause parents to become very obsessive. And one of the things I talked about, and this is very important for parents to understand, is what is known as hyper-competitive fears. And that is actually driving a lot of parents raising kids today to create more of these flaws, because rather than trusting God holistically, mm-hmm. we are becoming obsessive with what's happening. And so what that does is then we start avoiding conflict because we think we could just manage it and be a control freak through the paranoia. And then the last one, sadly, is the detached parenting. And this is a generation of many parents, sadly, who've come out of broken homes. They've come out of trauma. They didn't have a holistic family. They didn't come out of a family of faith. And as such, they struggle connecting with their own children. And so they become oblivious in how to provide for their children. Doesn't mean they don't love their child. They're just not adapt to how they can engage. And so they disregard conflict. And so that's a good way of kind of looking at what is taking place maybe in your individual home. Again, this isn't to discourage parents. This is to maybe recognize some of these flaws. And then once we're able to do that, and that parent or parents are very honest about it, that's when we can help them.
So again, Jason Jimenez is with us as we are talking about this book, Parenting Gen Z, Guiding Your Child Through a Hostile Culture. As it says, parents these days are in a panic mode. These teens and young adults, known as Generation Z, more stressed, more alone, more confused, less Christian than other generations. So it's certainly an issue not only for parenting, but how do we reach out to the next generation? And so this is an important issue. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of the concerns facing this generation, in particular, maybe the digital obsession and the fact that they're digital natives, also just the loss of Christian faith. And then finally, what can we do about that? Building a house on love and discipline. Jason, again, I've already kind of set the scene for the issue of digital devices. And, of course, we've talked about that with you. We've talked about that with Kathy Cook and all sorts of other individuals. But there are just a few other things we might add, just because this is a generation that has, in some respects, become so accustomed to digital devices that parents oftentimes say, as you talk about in the book, I can't even seem like I can communicate with my child.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate. And the reality is, Kerby, and this is what I do when I have sessions with parents or when I'm teaching a seminar and I have time to counsel with them, you have to face a reality of why that is. And one of the things we have to understand before we dive into about this obsession among this generation is the parents have obsession with devices as well. And when it comes to even having screen times and what that looks like with each individual child, and I talk about that in the book, so I won't go any further. I encourage people to pick up a copy and look at that. But we have to understand that when you talk to a child, a teen or a tween, here's the reality. They will admit that their device actually brings on more anxiety than anything. And yet, what is the number one thing they do when they have free time?
Yes.
YouTube videos, social media, right? So what they're admitting, I mean, they don't deny this. When you have a cordial, open conversation, they willingly admit that I have anxiety because of the device that is in my hand, which has become a part of their body, right?
Yes.
It's like an extension of their body, is creating a lot of these problems, and they don't know how to stop.
Right.
That is a real problem. And as you said in the last segment, that not only has this is affecting their brain in terms of their attention span, they also admit, and The Economist point blank said this, defining this generation, again, not in a negative light, but looking at the truth of what we're faced with, that they are stressed, depressed, and examine obsessed. And so these high expectations that this generation has, and also these expectations that they feel that they have with TikTok and Instagram, everything looks pretty and everything looks nice, and the fear of missing out kind of mentality that's been festering this generation for the last 15 plus years, that's all they've ever known. So when they're looking at this as an issue that's affecting their attention span, they also willingly admit that it causes more procrastination, and therefore their retention, their ability to comprehend information is lacking, even though we live in this digital age where information's at their palm of their hand, like we said. They're struggling. So what we have to recognize is that we have to address this with a heartfelt intent to resolve it rather than it get worse. And most parents tell me, well, I already gave them the phone, or they have an iPad and they have a TV in their room. And I'm telling you, what we have to do, Kerby, is we have to reevaluate what we have done in giving access to our kids. And some parents have to realize, you know what, it starts with me. If I've allowed, devices at the dinner table, if my kids are trying to talk to me and I'm always looking down myself, you are the one that are setting a bad example.
Good example. Yeah.
And if you have kids who are gamers and they're obsessed and there's no limits to what they do and what they're looking at, and you're not involved in walking them through with a biblical worldview, with words of encouragement, edification, and having face-to-face conversations, then you are literally losing your child in the process. So yes, when a parent says to me, I don't even know how to communicate with my child anymore, what we have to face first and foremost as the adult and as the parent who God has placed in that child's life, you have to take responsibility and say, it starts with me first. And that's what I'm hoping through the book, that yes, we can recognize this digital obsession, but also take responsibility of how we have created, just like we talked about some of those flaws, how we've actually created some of this in our own child's life.
Well said. Let me, if I can, move on to this idea of depleted faith. And you do talk about the decline of Christian truth. You've talked about this, the decline of Christian truth among millennials in your previous book. And of course, you talk about the decline of Christian truth among Gen Z. But rather than leave people hanging, you then have a whole section on talking to Gen Z about God, about Jesus, and the Bible. So it does seem to me that there are some very important ways to learn that. And you, of course, have been teaching a weekly apologetics class with Dr. Norm Geisler, an individual that was influential in my life and in yours as well when he was alive. And so there are some things we can and should do to communicate biblical truth in a way that really connects up with this generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I want to encourage people is, even though Gen Z, when you go back to like sexual fluidity, where so many of them now believe that you can adjust, or how you feel defines your orientation or your gender or sexual identity. And people think, oh my gosh, that's so disgusting and so non-biblical, and and people tend to get scared and they don't want to engage. The reality is, Kerby, and this is something that I was so moved by when I would be on the road engaging Gen Z and having conversations. And again, a lot of them were in a Christian environment, but they're very clear that they don't embrace what we believe, but they were very cordial. And I admire the fact that they had open conversations. The reality is they want to talk about God. And the second thing we have to understand is, even among people who believe in God, the God of the Bible, they don't have a robust theological understanding of the nature of who God is. And so immediately what we need to be doing in our homes, and I'm encouraging more and more churches when I'm traveling, teaching apologetics in churches, is we need to get back to the basics. Because sadly, and I talk about this in my other book when I lead into the conversation specifically about Jesus, if you were to take the majority view of Jesus in our culture today in America, it would be this: Jesus is either a woke teacher, or he was a mystical leader who was tapped into the universe, and he had this self-consciousness or this awareness of God, or he's a revolutionist, which most secular professors, like people like Bart Ehrman, believe. And if you take those combined views, which are false of Jesus, because we as Christians believe he is the second person in the Trinity, he's the Son of God, he's the Messiah. He died on the cross for our sins and rose again. When you're talking to the average Gen Zer, they're either going to take one of those three positions of Jesus. And if you take it collectively now, that is the majority view of Jesus today. Now, that's alarming, but here's the good news. They want to have a conversation about Jesus. They have views about Jesus. Though they may be wrong, they have views of Jesus. And we need to start there. And finally, most Gen Zers don't understand the Bible, and they don't believe that they have that they need the Bible. Less than 4%. We did this study actually with George Barna himself at the Cultural Center at Arizona Christian University. And I'll tell you, it was so troubling when we were getting this data back when I was writing this book. When you think about 12% of millennials have a biblical worldview and only 4% of Gen Zers, this is troubling. And they have a bad view of the Bible. So what do we need to do? Well, we as Christians who are equipped, we need to be proactive. We need to be a part of the Great Commission to make disciples among this generation, and know that though they are spiritual, they're not that religious. But they have views of God. They have views of Jesus. They have views about the Bible, and they're willing for Christians to actually go there with them. Most Gen Zers are not hostile.
Right.
I want people to understand that. Most of them are not hostile. Most of them want to engage with a Christian. They want to be argumentative. Now, again, you go back to language sensitivity. They may have different perspectives and views of certain words and how we should be, talking like this as opposed to like we were of times of old, because they call it microaggression. And I know that sometimes for us, we have to kind of adjust and learn. I'm not saying compromise, but with great conviction, we have to meet them where they're at. And so I believe strongly, Kerby, the more that we do this, we talk about God, we give them the right views of God according to Scripture, we talk about Jesus, who he is, the second person of the Trinity, and teach them that the Bible could be trusted, that it's the very word of God, that it's infallible, and you can put that in comparison to other religions around the world. This is stuff that they've never encountered. They get it from TikTok and YouTube, and it's a bunch of lies. And so the more we can engage them on that level, I'm telling you, we can win this generation for Christ.
Again, I would highly commend this book to you because you have an individual that has done the research, pulled together some of the surveys, has a background in worldview and apologetics, of course, has been a teacher at Summit Ministries and a number of things, and so brings together a lot of the important, if you will, intellectual ammunition about everything from God and Jesus and the Bible to questions about gender and even issues of suicide and depression and the rest. So lots of great material that is available there, but also some very practical ideas. And Jason, let's, if we can, talk about what parents can do. One of the ideas that you have is build your house on love, LOVE, which stands for L for laugh together, O for open up and share, V, value one another, and then E, encourage each other every day. And it does seem to me that we are talking about love in the generic sense, but we're also talking about putting, if you will, shoe leather to those ideas and giving love to your kids.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about any big business, or especially when you're watching right now, as we're recording this, we're in the playoff season for NFL. You're going to see tons of commercials, right, that have mottos to them. State Farm and Geico and all that kind of stuff, and Verizon Wireless, and it's all about how you're in good hands and we have a reliable network. Well, I've always encouraged, Kerby, everything we talked about up to this point is for every family to kind of find their own motto. Find something like a simple mission statement that always goes back to not just your existence, but how you are intentionally and purposefully engaging your wife, your spouse, your kids every day. So years ago, my wife and I came up with this concept called love. And it's a very helpful way in our busy schedules to make sure that I, every day with my 4 kids, go through love. Am I laughing with them? Am I finding opportunities and times to build into their life and to, have jokes or find a funny video, you know what I mean? Or play a fun game, because we know the value what laughter can bring in a relationship.
Yes.
And that has always been something very, very important to me. You don't have to be a funny stand-up comedian, right? But you find ways that you can be yourself and be fun, be engaging. Now, O is always look for opportunities to be open about something. Just the other day, before my kids went back to college, my oldest, we went on a little trip, in his truck to go grab something that I needed. And, I paid for his gas, and we went to Dave's Hot Chicken, which I'm telling you, Kerby, we got it really hot, and it was fun, and our mouths were burning. We laughed about it. But it was an opportunity that I was open about something that I had struggled with when I was roughly his age before I met his mom. And he never knew that story, and it just immediately caused my son, who's 20, he's bigger than me, to be emotional and kind of putting his arm around me as we walked outside the restaurant. It was just a great bonding time between father and son. So look for ways to be open with your kids. Don't always think you have to have the answers, that you have it all put together. V is to value one another. And this is important, especially when you have a bigger family, because inevitably there's going to be a member of the family, predominantly the younger ones, who are going to feel left out. And you always have to make sure that you put value to the human being who's made in the image of God, the value that family member brings to the family. The family is not complete without that family member. Therefore, that family member, that child, brings value to the home. They may not pay for the bills. They may, but they contribute in other ways. So we always have to make sure that we're looking to let them know how they're valued, how they bring dignity and respect. And of course, who needs more encouragement? All of us. And so E is simply that. Every single day, how can I encourage my kids? Okay, I'll give a plain example. On our family text, our group text, which I know many families have, especially when you have kids outside the house, I sent each one of them a prayer this morning based on my Bible reading. It is a way to call them out uniquely and encourage each one of my children in a special way. And the blessing is all of them, including my wife, responded with affirming one another. And that is a beautiful way of always finding ways to connect with your kids. So love, if you will, laugh, open, value, encourage, is a way that we look to engage our kids on a daily basis. That's our motto. So that's a great way for parents to start. If they don't have something that they can firm up as a mission statement or a motto, you can steal our motto and apply it to your life. I guarantee it. We get letters from people, emails from people all over saying how they've been applying love and they're seeing a huge difference.
So good. You do have some other messages. Your influence is irreplaceable, and we've done surveys at Probe and other places where we have certainly documented that, and secular researchers have found that. Message 2, your kids don't need an expert parent. You sort of already alluded to that a minute ago. Message number 3, let others speak into your children's lives. That is helpful because sometimes you may not necessarily be able to help them in an area of their influence. Let's say that they're really into car repair, and you're like, I don't even know which wrench to pick up. But I have a guy that's in my church that would come and maybe give some direction there, and this is certainly helpful for single parents. And so you've got just all sorts of unbelievably creative and helpful advice. But I thought just before I run out of time, Jason, let's, if we can, talk about how you see people using this. This is, of course, a book I want to put in the hands of any parent of a Gen Z. But the way you've put it together with some of the questions and things of that nature, it could be something that could be done in a small group setting, a life group, maybe even something that could be taught from the pulpit. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we're actually, as the book has come out, we're developing a video series, and we are working with a lot of churches this year, starting in 2024, even my own church doing a parenting seminar. Parents can use it in a one-on-one. Each chapter, as you know, ends with a parenting practice that the individual parent or the couple or in a small group can go through. I actually do the audio reading of it, so it was a personal touch that I brought to the book as well, to share my story as a father, to help encourage other parents around the world. Pastors I'm talking to and communicating with, I'm going to be teaching a lot this coming spring in churches and helping equip pastors to do the same. So yeah, it's a valuable resource. And I got to say before we conclude, though, the thing that was also important, and I have a whole chapter on discipline in the home. This is a huge one. This is so big, and I wish more parents would be open and receptive, because there's a lot of embarrassment where they don't know how to discipline their kids in the home. And so we spent a lot of time working with parents, Kerby, sharing their stories, which I share some of them in my own stories in the book, but how to properly go about disciplining your kids in the home as a mom and a dad, and making sure that mom and dad, if you're blessed with a mom and dad at home. I wasn't. I lost my mom when I was 15 years old. She was killed in a car accident. So even as a child, I saw my own father struggle as a single dad to try to raise his 4 boys after losing his wife in a car accident suddenly. And so fast forward all these years, when I got married to my wife 23 years ago, looking at what does it look like as a father to be the disciplinary, and what proper balance with grace does that look like? And so this is a huge question a lot of Gen Z parents have. And so we made sure that we put that in the book to help encourage them to be the authority that God has given them rightly and biblically for their kids.
Again, chapter 9 in the book, Discipline in the Home, and the kind of mistakes that those 3 different flawed models of parenting need to address as well. So, again, a book that I highly recommend, 270 pages, again, written by Jason Jimenez and published by Focus on the Family. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to standstrongministries.org. We have a link to the book itself, and you can get it in paperback or Kindle. So, Jason, always great to have you on the program. I hope for all the kind of impact that this book will have, and as always, look forward to the next opportunity.
Kerby, you're awesome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate your love and your support.
Well, hope you appreciated the conversation we had here today, and don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.